Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, the Friday podcast all about your Kindle. I'm Len Edgerly. Today is September 8th, 2017. Greetings from Ocean Park, Maine, where earlier today, it's nighttime now, but when the sun was out, I could look out through these windows at perfectly shaped waves here from the old cottage. I never was a surfer, except I've done body surfing all my life, and the waves that I saw out there today looked a little challenging to ride without a board. So I stayed indoors. We did have a bike ride, but spent most of the day working on the show. My interview guest is John Morgan, who heads Imprint, the children's publishing group at Macmillan in New York City. We had a wide-ranging conversation about digital publishing, children's books, and an author from Fairbanks, Alaska, whom he signed this summer for a 2-book deal.
Books these days, as they're produced, are pretty nice little objects. And then there's so many different ways that e-readers can work.
Also this week I'll have a fair amount to say about the bombshell news that Amazon is looking for a second headquarters somewhere. You might guess that I've got a couple of cities in mind that I hope might be considered, and they both seem to be mentioned prominently in the early speculation. We'll also talk about possibility of a new Fire TV coming out, and for the tech tip I'll have a warning for you, a button that you shouldn't click on if you see it in your email. The big story this week is an item which I'm sure kept the midnight oil burning in economic development offices throughout North America starting yesterday, Thursday. That was the day Amazon announced it is requesting proposals for the location of a second corporate headquarters, dubbed HQ2, somewhere in North America. The stakes couldn't be higher for states, cities, or regions that stand to gain up to 50,000 new jobs, paying an average annual salary of $100,000. Amazon said it could spend more than $5 billion developing the new headquarters over the initial 15 to 17 years of the project. Amazon said HQ2 is anticipated to be equal in size to the company's vast footprint at its original headquarters, which is outgrowing Seattle. Amazon accounts, one item I saw said that Amazon accounts for about 20% of the available office space in Seattle, so another location does seem to make sense. The request for proposals that Amazon posted lays out some parameters which enabled handicappers to begin guessing which cities might have the inside track. It needs to be a metropolitan area with a population of 1 million or more people. It needs to have good public transportation, including an international airport, good educational resources, and a stable and business-friendly environment. Amazon is not shy about suggesting that tax and other incentives will also be taken into account. Those economic development competitors have just 41 days left to submit their responses to the request for proposals, which are due October 19th, and the decision is going to be announced sometime next year. I was, of course, as you can imagine, glad to see Boston made it to the top tier of most of the think pieces that I read today. It is, of course, known for its fine educational institutions, especially in Cambridge, and it has the first subway system in the nation, the T, which was made famous by the Kingston Trio ballad about Charlie on the MTA. Logan International Airport is very handy from anywhere in Boston or Cambridge, about a 20-minute drive in light traffic from where we used to live by the Charles River, actually more like 15 minutes. It was an amazingly short drive. It's an old airport, though, and it has little room for expansion. Also, I think sites for Amazon's new headquarters, which will number more than 30 buildings totaling up to 8 million square feet of space, might be a little challenging to find in Boston, although there is an area called the Boston Seaport where General Electric is moving its headquarters, and one friend of mine that works in Boston said there might be enough area down there for a really large Amazon footprint. Boston's Mayor Marty Walsh was among those stepping up to the challenge quickly.
Amazon is calling on cities to submit proposals to host its second headquarters. Boston Mayor Marty Walsh says he's laser-focused on a possible bid.
We would love to see. Think about the public-private partnerships we could have with an Amazon here. Having a partner like Amazon would be incredible.
Walsh plans to pull together a team to discuss bidding for the company. The mayor has already welcomed a major company's headquarters, GE. The company moved to the Seaport District and received nearly $150 million in tax incentives from the city and state. Walsh says Boston could handle an Amazon headquarters, too.
If Amazon wants an East Coast headquarters, I don't see any city better in America than Boston, Massachusetts.
I love that Boston accent. I have a contact that I might be able to put an invitation in front of the mayor to come on the show just to get an idea for how does the city attract the Amazon headquarters. And so that would be fun if we can get him on sometime before the bid is put in on October 19th. Also, of course, I'm partial to the idea of a Denver Amazon headquarters. Denver didn't get mentioned in the coverage as much as Boston. I think that may be because national reporters are not as aware of Denver's excellent public transportation system as those of us who live in Denver. For the past 20 years, visionary leaders like John Hickenlooper, former mayor and now governor, have gained public support for major investments in an extensive light rail system in the Denver metro area, and then also a new commuter train line between Denver and the Denver International Airport. Denver's educational assets don't match Boston's, but the city's diverse can-do culture seems to be a good match with Seattle's. I was glad to see one analysis piece in Bloomberg mention both Denver and Boston on the short list, along with Toronto, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and Dallas. That piece by Philip Gray rightly called Amazon's request for proposals, quote, the Olympics of corporate relocations. The Washington, D.C. possibility is an intriguing one because Jeff Bezos, of course, owns the local newspaper there, and he also bought a big house near where the Obamas are living, and also Ivanka and Jared Trump. This is going to be interesting. For me, when the Patriots play the Broncos, I like to say I'm neutral because I know one of my two hometown teams is going to win. That's probably not quite true because for more than half my life I've called Wyoming and Denver home. In truth, I'm not much of a sports fan either, so it's not a big stakes decision for me who wins those contests other than talking with my family. Some of my family are real partisans of the Patriots. But in any case, with this Amazon decision, if Jeff Bezos were to ask my advice, I would probably give a slight nod to Denver, actually, because of available space, convenient location between the two coasts, a fantastic airport, and this is a pretty big factor for anybody that's lived all around the country. 300 days of sunshine on average in Denver. Boston would be a close second because of Harvard and MIT, and also Amazon already has a large presence in Cambridge for Lab 126's Alexa team. Here's another news clip about HQ2. This one I enjoy because it gives a feel for what this news must have looked like for the hometown of HQ1, Seattle.
Todd Bishop is the editor of GeekWire.
I think Amazon has been viewed in part by city leaders and by a lot of people in the community as a bit of an annoyance. You've got this monster in your midst, and here this shows that they really have other options.
Bishop says although Amazon indicates it plans to stay here, a second corporate headquarters could provide the option of someday moving out. Matthew Gardner, chief economist at Windermere Real Estate, doesn't see that happening.
They're not going anywhere. They're just outgrown us. They've got 6,500 job openings, and they're having a hard time filling them. If they believe they've tapped the talent pool that's in Seattle, where are they going to go?
I've got a couple of smaller items related to Amazon's current presence in Boston. When we were down in Cambridge for 2 days this week, I noticed that my Amazon Fresh membership enabled me to order items from Whole Foods. That was a pretty impressive short time for them to gear up, adding some Whole Foods products to the Amazon Fresh deliveries. The selection was not extensive, and I had to kind of stretch to reach the $40 threshold for a free delivery to our new home in Cambridge, which is about a mile away from where we used to live. I also noticed that when I placed the order on Tuesday afternoon, there were no delivery times available for the next day. That's usually you can just get right in on the next day, sometimes even the same day. Must have been a lot of people trying this out, perhaps. The earliest I could choose was Thursday between 4 and 6 a.m., and sure enough, 2 green containers with frozen and refrigerated items was on my doorstep when I checked shortly after 6, along with a paper bag of canned goods, including a favorite of mine, traditional baked beans. There is a Whole Foods market less than a mile from our house, so it's not too much of a challenge to go there and shop. But once in a while, with what I'm sure will be an increasing number of items to choose from, I will be bringing Whole Foods products right to our door with a couple of clicks of my mouse. I was also glad to see that Amazon has added a Boston location for its Prime Instant Pickup service. That's the one where you click on an item on your Amazon app on your phone and you can pick it up within 2 minutes. I would have to take the T across the Charles River to try this because the Boston pickup site is at Boston University. I will definitely do this on one of our next visits to Cambridge, probably getting off the Green Line at Boston University and then getting close enough to the store location so that I can hit that buy button and then see if my stuff really is going to be in a locker within 2 minutes. The other instant pickup locations are in Berkeley, California, Los Angeles, Columbus, Ohio, Atlanta, and College Park, Maryland. Finally, in news, I continue to hear a steady drumbeat of rumors of new Amazon devices. The latest comes from AFTVnews.com, which noted yesterday, September 7th, that the Fire TV box has been removed from the Fire TV family at Amazon.com. That leaves just the Fire TV stick and a couple of Fire TV Edition smart televisions. No more Fire TV box, which was selling for $90. The website noted that the second generation Fire TV box is listed as currently unavailable. The Post said this is all a good indicator that the new Fire TV devices will be announced soon. I want to thank Richard Lopez for sending me a link to that item. If you see a news item, especially in this season of possible new products, I'd love it if you would email me a link at podchronicles@gmail.com. I do see things pretty well. I've got Google Alerts, but sometimes I miss things, and it's great to have my TKC scouts out there tipping me off. That's, in fact, how I first heard about Amazon's HQ2 from listener Brett McNeil. Much appreciated. For the tech tip, I want to pass along a scam warning that I saw at Inc.com, posted by Joseph Steinberg on September 5th. I didn't receive this one myself, and I'm not always way alarmed by such warnings. I probably should be more so. But in this case, I know Inc. magazine. That's a brand I'm familiar with from years ago, and it's the kind of phishing campaign that could perhaps cause serious harm if you are an Amazon customer. The way it works apparently is the perpetrators were sending out mass emails that look as if they come from Amazon, thanking customers for making purchases on Prime Day back in July. That, of course, includes a lot of people, me included, but I haven't received one, as I said. The emails invite recipients to write a review of their Prime Day experience and receive a special $50 bonus credit for doing so. Already that sounds a little fishy to me, but I guess the graphics of the email looked convincing. If you fall for it, you'll be sent to a clone of Amazon's site, not the real Amazon.com, and you'll be asked to enter your username and password. And if you do that, the information will fall into very questionable hands. Inc.'s post concludes with this good advice. If you ever receive an email allegedly from Amazon asking you to take any action, the safest way to do so is to ignore any links in the email and instead enter https://www.amazon.com in your web browser. Once you log in, you can access your orders and communicate with customer service regarding any questions. Good advice. Time now for the interview. John Morgan came to my attention via my Fairbanks, Alaska friend, the painter Kess Woodward, who has been a guest on the show at least twice. Kess's writer friend Paul Gracie this summer sold 2 books to Macmillan, and Paul's visit to John Morgan, his book editor in New York, turned out very well. I was intrigued to hear about this because I enjoy learning what life is like at one of the big 5 publishers, and John sounded like a bright guy with a varied background since graduating from Brown University in 1998. I reached him by Skype on Tuesday, September 5th at his home in Manhattan, and I began by asking him to describe the media jobs he's had that led to his current position at Macmillan.
I was always interested in TV and film. I've always played a lot of video games, but I'm also a big reader. So I wasn't really sure exactly what I wanted to do out of college, and then I went into book publishing at Penguin in science fiction and fantasy because I'm a big nerd. I had a fun career there for about 7 years, and then I moved over to DC Comics, and I worked on all kinds of books there, but I also worked on video games and eventually film and TV development. And then since then, I've worked making apps and helping to put on events in addition to working on really complex books. And now I'm executive editor at Macmillan at a part of Macmillan called Imprint, focusing on kids' books, everything from picture books up to the occasional adult title, but with a real focus on middle grade and young adult. I sometimes say that my career path is a little bit like those family circus cartoons where Billy's kind of wandering all around, but he kind of ends up home all the same.
So at Macmillan, are you now have taken kind of a step away from digital? Are you mainly talking about books that show up in print for kids?
Well, it's interesting. I'm definitely mostly focusing on book editing, but the digital experience has been really helpful to me in a lot of different ways. And we are doing the occasional digital project. We're looking at doing an iOS sticker app, and I don't know, there's different sort of initiatives. I don't think it's really the focus of my job right now, but I always think I have a lot of friends who stayed or just had a more consistent, straightforward path in book publishing, and I feel like having wandered around a little, in some ways it, meant that I didn't have a real base to build on in terms of books I've edited, but it also means that I have a lot of different experience that's really been helpful to me.
I would think that the folks that hired you at Macmillan would have seen all of your digital experience, and maybe the hiring of someone like you would indicate that they see more of that kind of stuff being done by Imprint.
I can't speak to that. I don't also think that I think that basically the idea of having any kind of digital component, it's just another piece of the overall publishing puzzle. So I don't think they have a real initiative overall at Macmillan where it's like we want to have this big, rich digital life. It's more like we want to help service our authors and also service our readers. And, here's somebody I would hope that they look to in me who, has a lot of experience in thinking about that in a lot of different ways.
One thing I enjoyed seeing was you talking about Mr. Robot, did that have a digital component as well as the very clever stuff you were doing with the actual paper part of that product?
Well, the interesting thing for me that's happened a lot in my career is I've worked on really complex books, and I've also worked on kind of hopefully creative digital projects, and sometimes the two forces are at odds even within the same project. So with Mr. Robot, even though the show is so digitally focused, we did that book with Abrams. The book was so interactive that Abrams put together a really nice ebook for it. But at the same time, I think the focus was really about making it as digital as possible. Another thing that happened to me in the past was sometimes people would come to me with books that they were making as beautiful a print object as they could. It was then more of a challenge to figure out how we could put it in E because they had basically tried to make something that wouldn't work that well in E.
So sometimes it can be complementary, and other times it's just a whole different direction.
Yeah, with Mr. Robot, I think you can definitely get a great experience from that ebook, but I would say that everything, all the decisions that were made on that ebook were made sort of after we considered it as a print object first, and then try to figure out how it could be, then translate that to digital, as opposed to other times you try and think of both from the ground up and figure out how it could branch in either direction.
Yeah. There was a comment of one of your coworkers from your stints at Penguin and LinkedIn remembered you as always being ahead of the curve on the ways that digital media would come to change the book industry. Do you still consider that one of your strengths, or that you're seeing what's coming in book publishing because of your personal interest in the things that you've done so far in your career?
Well, I'm always hesitant to be like, I'm great. I'm really, in touch with the zeitgeist. I think it's more just that I'm a big nerd. I've always liked gadgets, and I've always wanted to do stuff digitally if I can. So I remember at Penguin, I don't know if the person who wrote that comment was thinking this specifically, but when I first came into publishing almost 20 years ago, they were still, for instance, copy-edited manuscripts were still copy-edited on paper with Post-its. And you'd have to have this one special, copy-edited manuscript that you had to be really careful of. And, we would overnight them and make sure that it was all insured, because if it was lost, the whole production of the book would be thrown into chaos. And I was, at Penguin anyway, a very early adopter of Word, using Word and just its track changes and comments feature, which now everyone uses. But back then I had to explain to all my authors, and I would sometimes then have to hand in something that looked a little messy into copying a production. So I think I always come of it just from a consumer. Like, I like gadgets, I like digital stuff, and I'm always trying to think of just what I like and how I can make the projects I work fit more into my own interests. So I don't know if that makes me better positioned or not. I more wonder if I'm going to become an old fogey now and won't understand how computers work. But so far, that hasn't happened.
Yeah. The enhanced ebook topic, I've been following the Kindle for almost 10 years now, and right from the start, I just thought, well, there's going to be amazingly creative things that are going to be done when you match the power of a story and the immersive experience of a book with what you can do digitally on a screen. And so far, I've been sort of disappointed that it seems like it's somebody drops a video in of maybe the author talking about the book, or there just hasn't seemed to have been a breakthrough melding of those technologies yet that looks like it could be a whole new platform for creativity. But do you have a similar, what's your sense of where we are in terms of the potential for traditional written stories to be married to technology on screens in a way that's truly something new and exciting for authors and creators?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think one thing I want to make clear is I'm an executive editor at Imprint at Macmillan. I'm not working on enhanced ebooks there, so I'm not really speaking to whatever strategies they might have. Mm-hmm. But I've definitely thought about this a lot, just because, again, I'm a gadget guy, and I like lots of different kinds of digital projects, and I like things that sort of explore that. And I agree, there hasn't been either a steady stream or feeling like things are growing, and there also hasn't been like a killer app necessarily, except I guess there's one that I would look at that we would talk about all the time. I think it was called Snowfall. It was a New York Times interactive feature. They still mention that all the time. And I think about that, I mean, that's on the web, and I feel like the web is one of those universal places where everyone can go and get something interactive, and they can all view it, and there's a bunch of different ways to view it, and the platforms are pretty wide open. And then on the other side, I feel like with a book, like, it's not like books are broken. I look at my nieces. I have 4 nieces who are in their early teens or tweens, and they are pretty agnostic in terms of if they're reading a book or if they're reading something digitally. They just kind of want the words. And the book, as we've built them, books these days as they're produced are pretty nice little objects. And then there's so many different ways that e-readers can work. Or you can read a book on your phone. A ton of people read books on their phones. They read them on the web. They read them on an e-reader of choice. They can read it e-ink. They can read it on something like a tablet, like the iPad. And I feel like that is sort of, none of that process seems messed up to me. There's a lot of consumer choice, and there's a lot of different ways actually to read the same book. My memory with enhanced ebooks when I was working in them at Penguin was it was so challenging because there were so many different formats that same thing that made it easy to read a book made it very difficult to figure out what kind of enhancements you could put in that everyone would be able to view in a way that made them look good. If you're looking at even a video on a phone, it's never going to look as good as it is on a tablet. If you're on an e-ink reader, none of that is possible. Far be it from me to be able to really say what the future of enhanced ebooks is, but I know that was one of the challenges that we kept hitting. And I think in the end, if somebody's looking for a video or they're looking for some other kind of interactive content, they can usually find that in a creative way on the web, or they can just find it in separate pieces. They can read a book and then they can look up the author's YouTube channel and they can find all of these different supplementary materials sort of at their own pace in the place where it usually makes the most sense to find those items.
Yeah. Do you know of any books that have successfully been transitioned into becoming video games?
That's an interesting question. There's a game that I just got for the PlayStation 4 called The Witcher. I think it's actually like the 3rd or 4th game in the series. And I think it's based on a foreign book. I have a lot of theories, actually, that I'm always trying to think about, because I had been a book editor and then I started working on video games, and it became really important to me to figure out the difference between the two. And I kind of came out with that they're pretty different. In fact, there was this book that I had worked on at my previous job at a company called Melcher Media called New York Collapse that was a book that tied into a video game called Tom Clancy's The Division. And we expressly tried to make them totally different experiences. They existed in the same world, but the book, books tell a linear story, and a video game is more like a space where you can play. And so if you look at Tetris, there's no story there. There is, but the story is not the focus. The story at most is a story about gravity. And I think that the two are a little at odds, and you usually get better products if you kind of figure out how different they are and go play to those strengths.
Yeah, makes sense. Have you experimented with virtual reality, the VR headsets, and thought about that in light of what you know about storytelling? Yeah,
at my old job, they ran at Melcher Media, they ran a yearly conference called The Future of Storytelling. Every October, it's sort of an invitation-only thing, and the focus was very much on how stories and interactivity interact. And so we had a bunch of different virtual reality setups in the office. I remember one of the killer apps was Tilt Brush, which I think is owned by Google, where you can kind of draw in 3D. Yeah. and it was really incredible. And again, it really exemplified the difference. It wasn't a story at all. It was like a painting program, but it really felt pretty immersive. There was a lot of interesting creative projects that we saw that were definitely narrative at Melcher. Again, the physical book is a pretty successful object, and one of the things that they were always thinking about at Melcher and that you hear a lot about is how people are like, maybe virtual reality is actually just a stepping stone to augmented reality, where you're putting on a set of goggles. I think Microsoft's HoloLens is one of the big examples, and you're seeing an overlay on what is actually in front of you in real life. And again, the book is a successful object if augmented reality kind of ends up being something that's more common in a bunch of different formats, or there's some agreed upon format. It seems that you could have a print book, you could have a great experience, and then you could put on a set of goggles and get all the enhancements you want on top of it. And it's a way to make an object that works in two different ways. So if I were to say, where do I think all this could go? I definitely think augmented reality is something to watch.
Well, let's turn to Paul Gracie. That's kind of how we connected. Paul's a friend of mine in Fairbanks, Alaska, a terrific painter, Kes Woodward. What most attracted you to his writing, leading to the contract for the two books that Paul is going to be writing with you?
Sure. So I signed up, I guess it was like 2 or 3 months ago, The Wildlands by Paul Gracie, and it was great to have him show up. He actually visited New York early in the summer, so I got to meet him, which isn't always the case, especially when your author lives in Alaska. The book was really grabby from the word go. He has, I think, written a few different books, but only had one published so far, Surviving Bear Island, and it's a big survival book. For middle grade readers, this is more young adult. Nobody can read the book yet. We're still editing it.
What's it about, The Wildlands?
It's about a few teenagers, mostly a teenage boy and his sister, a younger sister. I think she's 6 years younger. And they're in an Alaska that's kind of been ravaged by a changing climate, and also there's been a series of fires that have basically ripped through Alaska. And the idea is that society has kind of broken down, and they don't really know what's going on outside of even Alaska, but they know in Alaska everyone's basically abandoned it. They've evacuated, and there's a few people remaining. And they have to survive, they've run out of food. They basically have to cross the sort of wilderness, the true wilderness, broken wilderness that Alaska has become, and get to the other side of it, searching for other survivors, mostly avoiding other survivors. I think that was the number one thing that attracted me the most to the book is he builds a great sense of tension that's very believable. Paul is a big survivalist wilderness explorer, so he really knows what he's talking about. And then routinely in the book, people are kind of looking behind them and they see someone else. And he's created that sense of fear so successfully that whenever they see another person, you just immediately kind of seize up. There's very short chapters, and most of the cliffhangers are just them seeing another person far away. Yeah, it reminded me of in Jaws, where Spielberg does such a good job of making you afraid of the water that whenever anyone even steps in a puddle, you kind of freak out in the movie. He successfully does that in The Wildlands. So.
And that's due out next year? Or no, 2019?
I think early 2019. We don't have a set date for it, but it'll probably be in the spring. Yeah, and then he's got a follow-up, which he and I are just beginning to talk about now. But he's got a lot of great ideas. He's a teacher. He's into wilderness. He's very focused on making really readable books that also have a lot of interesting things to say, I think, about all the topics he's tackling, survival and the wilderness, how to survive. Everyone's always looking for the next hatchet in children's publishing, and sometimes that gets a little overused. I think when I talked about it in-house, I was like, everyone says they found the next hatchet, but maybe I have? I don't know.
Now I don't know what that is. What is the first hatchet?
Hatchet is, I think it's about 15 or 20 years old.
Hatchet, it was written by Gary Paulson and published in 1987. I'll have a link in the show notes.
It's just a really great middle grade book about a boy who gets trapped in the wilderness. And I'm not a wilderness guy at all, but the book walks you through how he figures out how to survive. All he has with him is a hatchet.
I see.
I remember reading it and being like, oh, maybe I would figure that out. Yeah, maybe I could survive. And it's just a quaint book.
Yeah. Well, I've been interested to hear about you and Paul and have a chance to talk to you. I hear so much about the role of the editor in publishing, and particularly in light of people who have gone to self-publishing, and what are they giving up in terms of having an editor at a traditional house like you? People can hire editors, and so I keep hearing about editors, but I sometimes wonder, well, what does an editor do? Paul, I reached out to him and said I was going to be talking with you, and he wrote a nice description of his experience of working on the Wildlands with you at this point. He says, I was impressed by how articulate John was in what he saw in terms of places where the story could be worked on and the depth he went into. At the same time, he was able to paint with a pretty broad brush, which allowed me as the author to authentically and organically work on the story to explore some of the ideas he put forth. It was more an invitation to think about certain story aspects than a list of things to do. Does that kind of resonate with how you see your role as an editor when you're working with most of your authors, as to how much you're putting into the book versus how much you're giving space for the author to actually write it? It must be kind of a delicate interface.
Well, first off, it's great to hear Paul say that, because definitely that is something I would want an author to think or believe. Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot too, because I'm always neurotic and worried I'm screwing it up or going to mess the book up or leave it in worse state than I found it. And there was an editor at Knopf who had a really great interview, I think, with Poets and Writers magazine, and she said that the editor is really supposed to be the first, most enthusiastic reader of the book. They're the ones who are really the cheerleader for the book. Like they want to love the book as it is, but also help the author figure out how to make the book everything it can be. And for me, I always think when I'm reading books, there's always kind of two questions. One is the book kind of in publishable state? Can we publish it as is without any work? Which sometimes just means, are there logical errors that need to be fixed, or is there kind of a consistent niggling problem where this character just isn't really likable? And then is the book as good as it can be? And the book can usually pretty quickly pass that barrier from how to get it to publishable state. It will never reach the state of is it as good as it can be. But my goal is always to help diagnose problems which are either, from my experience as an editor and a reader and a person who thinks in the industry, I really just know this is going to get in the way. Like, this isn't working story-wise, or this isn't going to work market-wise. And then there's also just, I personally had this reaction to it, and I represent, if we're trying to hit a mass market audience, some unknown but significant percentage of readers who will stumble over the same thing. So I try and be clear in those two things, or just where I'm coming from with my authors. And then I don't know, I always tell them, if I'm telling you something, I'm trying to be articulate about what the problem is. This character isn't working for me, and it's on me to figure out why, so I can tell you. I don't want to just be like, oh, they're unlikable, I don't like them, figure it out. I'm trying to be like, oh, I think it's because of this scene and this scene, and when I really look at it, I see this. And then if I have a suggestion, I always try and come up with almost bad suggestions, because I want them to know that it's their book. And in fact, I don't want them to take my suggestions. And also I feel like they're going to be naturally resistant to suggestions. No one wants my suggestions to be in the book. They want the author to have written the book. And the author should feel ownership over everything they do. So if I do have a suggestion, it's usually to just try and be clear about the problem. Neil Gaiman had this quote, when someone points out a problem, they're almost always right, and when they talk about how to solve it, they're almost always wrong.
So I love that. If you offer only bad suggestions, you're sort of pointing them towards something and giving them a platform to say, well, now that's a ridiculous idea. Obviously, this is the way to fix it. So is that sort of what's behind the genius of a bad suggestion?
Yeah, I mean, I try and be pretty open to them about the psychology. I mean, the funny thing is I think about the psychology with myself, and when I tell people to critique what I'm doing, I'm like, look, here's what I do to other people, and I think even if you know that that's kind of what's going on behind the curtain, it's still really effective to just basically be like, I'm going to almost tee it all up for you, but leave it for you to knock the dominoes down. It just is an easier way of offering criticism and getting a good revision going. Again, you want people to feel ownership. I just feel that that's the most important thing. And if they feel ownership, it works. And if they don't, they're not going to be happy with it, and they're not going to feel like it's theirs, and it is theirs. I buy the publishing rights for the most part for the books I work on. I don't buy the copyright. The author owns it. It's their name on the book. My name isn't on it. And I'm fine with that. I think that makes it really clear on whose book it should be.
There's something that I've been doing since I've been reading on the Kindle that I wonder if people in your kind of work also use as a tool, and that's the ability to search for a word. And as an example, I loved Paul's book, Surviving Bear Island, but I noticed that he was using colloquial usage of, instead of going to, it was gonna, Gonna. It's just an aesthetic preference on my part, nothing against the book. But I looked it up and I found 70 examples of gonna in the book.
It was actually only 45. I just checked.
And other times I've found a word that it just seems I'm hearing this word a lot in this book, and I'll look it up and say, man, that's in there 30 times. If I was editing this book, I would cut it in half. But is that something that's sort of built in when you're reading manuscripts to use a simple word count to tighten a book and the usage of the language? Or maybe that's more a proofreading thing than a book editor thing?
Well, I mean, I think, I'm supposed to basically leave stuff to the copy editor or the proofreader when it feels like it's something, a consistency thing. I mean, I also think about it, too, as I'm editing. But, I mean, of course, we're not reading on the Kindle. We're reading, I do read submissions on the Kindle. But when I'm editing, I'm definitely editing in Microsoft Word. And Word is very powerful in being able to do find and replace and find that kind of stuff. And that's definitely something that I do. If I'm like, is this consistent throughout, or am I seeing this too much? I remember a friend of mine, actually, someone I didn't edit, had written a book. It's very easy to misuse the word that. That is a word that you can kind of shove in. It'll be grammatically correct, but it's often not really needed, and it can just sort of slow sentences down. And I remember I had read a book for him that he had written for, just to give him friendly advice. And I said, you're kind of using the word that a lot. And again, I didn't want to give him the full comment because I felt like if he didn't think it himself, he wasn't going to make the change. So I said, why don't you just do a search and see how many instances you find? And at first he was like, I'm using that correctly. And I'm like, okay, I was just saying. And then later he came back to me and he's like, I did a search and I used it like 500 times. And I'm like, yeah, that felt like a lot. And he's like, yeah, I'm kind of going through like moment by moment. The one danger with that in editing is you kind of want to do that really at the beginning of the process. Or you want to do that as soon as you're noticing it. Because if you get all the way through the book and then you kind of go back and do a find replace, you're looking at things out of context, or you can actually screw up a book instead of fixing an issue with it.
Yeah, makes sense. When you're reading manuscripts or just doing your own reading for pleasure, print, phone, tablets, e-ink, what's the mix of devices you're using as a gadget lover who loves to read?
Sure. It's funny because I think everybody thinks that the way they read is like clearly the best way, and everyone else just needs to be convinced of it. It was back when I was working in TV and film development in LA at DC Comics. That was when I got a Kindle e-ink reader, and I just really fell in love with the e-ink technology, which I feel like is a real love it or hate it. But I love it. I love that it's got the sort of front-lit nature. It feels easy on my eyes. I love that I can't do anything else on that device but read. So I really read almost exclusively Kindle, which is sometimes weird because I've worked on books even recently that are so print-focused. New York Collapse didn't have an ebook. That was that book that I had done tying into Tom Clancy's The Division. So as a normal reader, I wouldn't even have encountered it. I had remember that I had seen statistics when I was working in enhanced ebooks that only digital readers like me represent less than 10% of the population. We're very small. It's like single digits. Most people are either only print or they're a mix of print or digital.
Yeah. And within the digital, the e-ink percentage seems to be shrinking as people shift to reading on phones and tablets.
Yeah, I mean, definitely I still encounter people who don't even really know what an e-ink device is, or I'll show it to them and they'll be confused by it. Well, of course, I'm also following, there's all these advances in e-ink technology. It's very interesting to try and figure out where this is all going to go. I've seen a lot of different things, people talking about different kinds of monitor technology and feeling like, well, we have all these nice, beautiful Retina screens. Is this really the best way? I mean, ideally, we'd have a screen that could refresh really quickly and be both front-lit and back-lit, depending on how you choose. It seems like that is inevitable, but it also seems like we're pretty still far off from reaching it.
Yeah. I suspect there's going to be a new Kindle device coming out this fall just because it's the 10-year anniversary of the first one, and it's been a while since they've had and I'm kind of surprised that Amazon keeps putting money into new e-ink devices. I think there's sort of a love of the first dance partner they had, because otherwise the market just seems to have moved on from that platform.
I don't know much about that market, actually, since I'm not even working in any way on anything related to Amazon stuff. But I definitely personally really am happy that there are e-ink devices, and I love my Apple devices too, but I would always be curious to see what Apple would cook up for an e-ink device. I don't know. It can be frustrating. I remember it was frustrating when I was working on enhanced ebooks to feel like there were so many different choices for what people could be reading on. But now as a consumer, I'm really happy I have that consumer choice.
I closed my conversation with John asking him to recommend some children's books, and it turns out he's got some experience on this topic from his own family.
Well, I have nieces. I have 4 nieces who run from 10 to 14. And definitely I would say one thing I've realized pretty quickly is most of my favorite books are middle grade or young adult books that I remember from that age. Even stuff that everybody loves, like Harry Potter, to stuff like Hatchet, which I talked about. House of Stairs was a really great book. There's a really terrific book by John Sleater that I love called Interstellar Pig. That's a terrific book. The Westing Game is another great book. But I realized right about when the kids were ready to read those books was the exact time when me suggesting a book was going to get a response where they were like, "Oh, okay, I'll decide if I want to read it or not." And I'm like, "Oh, all right." And then they would come back to me with a book that maybe I didn't like as much or feel like was maybe as on target, and they'd be like, "This is the best book ever, Uncle Johnny." So I kind of feel like, editing, I think a lot about editing, and I think a lot about how it sort of different things in my life that intersect with it. And one of them is that I feel like actually buying them books I like and almost immediately saying, "I don't think you'll like this, put it on your shelf, read it if you want, just don't throw it away." And then eventually what will happen is a year and a half later, when they've decided that they want to read it on their own, they'll come to me and be like, "Oh, I really like that book you gave me, Uncle Johnny." Or they'll tell me even better, "I really like that book." And I'll be like, "I gave you that book." And they'll be like, "No, you didn't." And I'll be like, "Yeah, no, I did." So I feel like I try not to get too attached on different books that I would want people to read, because even as an adult, too, I think the same advice holds, that you can sort of put a book in front of someone, but you almost have to Inception style it into their brain to get them to want to read it. There's one book series I'm working on called Prince Not So Charming that's very fun, by an author named Roy L. Hines, which is not his real name. But those books are nice young chapter books. They've got really fun illustrations. They've been a real lot of fun to work on, and they're very funny. So I guess maybe, hopefully, a kid will be young enough that you could give them to a kid and they would actually listen to you. They might not be quite out of that range yet, but we'll see.
I have been speaking with John Morgan, Executive Editor at Imprint, the Macmillan Children's Publishing Group. Thanks very much, John.
Sure, thank you so much.
In content, I want to mention the new Kindle in Motion version of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. John and I had talked about enhanced ebooks in the interview. I think this Kindle in Motion capability, which we saw in the Scott Parazynski book and some others, really does hit the sweet spot of a subtle enhancement of the book that doesn't detract from the story. And I loaded the book, the sample for the book, onto my Fire HD 8 here, so I want to open it up, and I'm just going to try to explain with words what the experience is. And if you're interested in it, I really recommend that you follow the link I'll put in the show notes so that you can see it yourself. It starts when you open the cover on it, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. There's a big steam engine, and there's steam just rising up from the engine. There's an owl floating over the people on the platform. But most of the image is fixed. The animation is only sort of a layer over the fixed image of the book. And then when you move on to the book, it shows how to use this capability. The title page, which has J.K. Rowling and notes that the illustrations are Jim Kay, has this big fat bullfrog on a book, and his eyes blink, and his tongue sticks out. He does just these sort of funny little small gestures that make it obvious that he is animated, and it's just very playful. So this is high quality art that they have built into the Kindle in Motion view of the book. The other thing that's intriguing is that on some of the pages, like here's one, there's a crow down in the lower right corner. It's not animated. It just sits there. So you find yourself looking at it and say, well, I wonder if that crow is going to blink at me. Well, it never does. But then you go a few pages more, and you're going to see something that does move. So there's a surprise element of which of these attractive illustrations in the book are going to do something and which ones aren't. I think it's excellent. I think we're finally hitting on that sweet spot where the creativity of the illustrator can be worked into animation, and it absolutely fits with the text of the book on a device like my Fire HD8 here. Obviously, not such a winning thing on an e-ink Kindle. I don't think it's even visible on an e-ink Kindle, but on the color tablets, it looks pretty sharp. That's it for this week. My guest next week will be Jennifer Cass. She's the vice president for Amazon Books. That's the bookstore unit of Amazon, so it's going to be fascinating to hear what she's up to. There'll be 13 of these stores by the end of this year. This is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles from Ocean Park, Maine. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen to my show. Have a great day. Bye.